welcome to Writer. I'm your host, Kat Filer, also known as KJ Filer, author of Shadowrunner. My guest today is Terry R. Hill, a science fiction writer and author of the series In the Days of Humans, where he weaves in space exploration realism, drawing from 20 years of experience from working at NASA. His other novels span speculative fiction, historical fiction, and what it was like to live through the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. Terry has short stories included in the Amazon bestseller Future Chronicles Doomsday, an anthology by Sam Peralta, and an authorized novella placed in Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet universe. He also has short stories in Daniel Arthur Smith's Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Terry has been published by the Associated Press and covered by media outlets including CNN, MIT's Technology Review, Forbes.com, and the National Geographic video Living on the Moon, which aired in 2009. Terry has also been identified as one of NASA's constellation stars and who's who in NASA. Hi, Terry. How you doing?
Good morning, Kate. How you doing?
Good. It was just so good you could join me. I'm really happy to have you as a guest. So let's get right into it and start with the Halfway Home project. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, that's been a very interesting project that's spanned years now. It started off with me reading the novel of this independent author, Hugh Howey, and it was a project that Sam proposed out there, and I at the time I had not read any of Hugh books at the time, so in reading it is quite the pleasure because it was something I hadn't read before, and he really drew me in. So I thought, yeah, I definitely want to be part of this project. So I was fortunate enough to have other authors that were signed up for that project that I had known from other efforts, and we were all kind of friends. So we all decided to, about a handful of us decided to kind of lay Easter eggs in each of our stories and to kind of point to the other stories, kind of a 6 degrees of separation type of thing to kind of add some additional depth and dimensions to this collection of work.
That's really cool because people who have read any of the stories from any of you guys are going to recognize that. And people who haven't are probably going to go looking for it now that they know. So that's
Right.
really cool. Yeah. And I think that Hugh Howey did the forward for this.
Yes, he did. He did write it forward to the anthology, and of course, since we started this project 5, 6, 7 years ago, whenever it was, he's done great things and become almost a household name. And he's got the Silo series that's up on Apple TV right now, and he's done a lot of great things. So we're all very proud of him.
Yeah. Well, and Sam too. Sam has done a number of all of his projects are very successful, but he did a very odd thing. I thought that it was an odd thing in the beginning, where he was pulling in authors that were pretty big names in the industry and then putting people like me who I had nothing, was nobody. And you're in this same anthology with somebody of that stature. And I can tell you that it certainly benefited me in terms of having a career as an author. And I think Sam is responsible for launching a lot of people too. And then I want to sing your praises too, because I tend towards sci-fi. My latest novel is not specifically sci-fi, but you've been my go-to when I have a question about anything science related.
It's always been a pleasure, Kate, to tell you.
Yeah. And so you talked about the Easter eggs. What about this project is like, I don't know, different? And it is. I've started reading it. It's just really different.
So I think what's so different about this one is that the whole premise of the novel, the original novel, and the premise of the original novel was, we did human exploration, but it was almost at an exponential level. You know, some would argue whether or not Earth had enough resources to do kind of what Hugh laid out in the novel, but that's beside the point. But the premise of the novel was that they were sent out hundreds and thousands of different seed ships, if you will, to thousands of planets across the universe, to kind of expand the borders of human civilization. And that alone allowed us to set up a myriad of worlds that could be literally anything. It's almost like a multiverse type of situation, except, in reality. So that was really kind of neat, because other anthologies where you're writing in the canon or in the universe of a particular novel, it's usually only one reality in that novel, right? Well, what Hugh did, which really facilitate that again, was had it so that it could be on any planet with any biome or whatever, with any environment, with any indigenous life forms or anything. And that really just kind of allowed the imagination to go wild. So the authors almost had free reign, so long as we stuck to a short canon of facts for that universe.
What were the canon facts that you had to stick to?
So it was kind of the main characters that were in the original um, novel, if you wish to write in that universe, in that particular world. Um, it was basically the premise of the seed ships being sent out from Earth, and the basic premise as to why they were sent out, and that each of the ships that were sent out had an AI called Colony, which was supposed to be the caretaker and to wake up the crew and actually get them gestating, actually en route in time to, be born, if you will, adults, and to start carrying on the mission. Some, in Hugh's original novel, that colony AI kind of went a bit rogue and uh, caused some problems, right? So, some of the worlds decided to follow on with that as an inherent flaw of the software itself, and some of them, it worked out differently. But it's a really, really neat project to work on.
Yeah. And I thought the story premise was pretty cool too, because so many of the space exploration stories include people being in stasis, which is fine. But the idea that these weren't actually people, not technically, they were being sent out, like you said, they were seeds. So now you have the problem of getting them up to speed and getting them up to the age where they could be independent. I just thought it was a really great way to do that.
Yeah, and my particular story, I'm not going to steal the ending or anything like that, but the whole premise of my story is, it'd been hundreds of years since these seed ships been sent out, and they hadn't heard anything from Earth.
Okay.
Right? So there's that inherent mystery of why not. And as we know, with technology and the world around us, it changes so fast. So my story is all about them traveling back home to Earth to figure out what's going on. Why have we not heard from home? And what they
Wow.
find.
Wow. That's a great idea. So that's sort of the reverse. You're out there and then you try to go home.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I haven't read all of them. I just got my copy, so I'm starting out. And I hate to just kind of jump around. I know you can because it's an anthology, but I just started from the beginning. So, and I know that some of this is you're going to have a lot of realism in this because of your job. So, how does your day job affect your writing?
It, the day job, for those who don't know, of course, I've worked at NASA in human space flight and hardware development and program management, what have you, for, almost 25 years now. Um, so kind of what it takes to get it done. And, as one person described what it's like to work at NASA, particularly Mission Control, is, hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. Um, and that's kind of the way it is. It's you want to do right by the astronauts, and you want to make sure that you double check, triple check, backup and redundant systems, and so. And also, my experience over the years, I've also I was a deputy program manager for the astronaut health program. So I understand what the effects of spaceflight are on the human body, long term and short term. So that adds some additional realism. But when you're writing science fiction, you can't write it like reality, because it would be a very long and boring book for most of it, you know, except for the last 3 pages, and then it got exciting. So you have to take liberties, but just for the same reason why I can't watch most sci-fi movies that are centered around plus or minus 5 years of the present, because I just can't watch it because they just it's all so very wrong just for the sake of drama. It has to have be in a galaxy far away. So you have the suspension of disbelief in place. So what I try and do is make my writing as real as possible, and without making it incredibly boring, hopefully. But what I've gotten back from readers are that I could totally see this as you're describing it, and I think it's because I've totally seen it, most of it, and that helps. That just helps bring the extra level of depth and realism to, I think, the storytelling.
Well, and you've been in the field long enough that you've seen advancements in technology. How does that affect how your stories change going forward?
Yeah, it's always the battle, isn't it? When you're writing science fiction or anything into the future, because if you're a good sci-fi writer, you can predict the future. Um, you know, or if you're writing far enough into the future, if you're writing speculative fiction, which is kind of today, then your stories can age if you get too specific, and that's kind of the advice I've given to other starting authors that go into science fiction is be very careful. I mean, because everybody wants to jump straight into world building and defining the new key technology that they've come up with and how super duper awesome it is, and they spend volumes talking about explaining that technology, and that's interesting, but usually just for them,
Mhm.
right? And it also can age out their story as technology goes. But if you look at the real masters of writing, they don't spend a lot of time trying to prove to you that their warp drive really works.
Yeah.
They said, "Look, I got a warp drive. I'm moving on with the story." You know,
Yeah.
and that's what really I advise other authors to really do, is that really kind of think of from their perspective, the reader's perspective, and how really important is it to the plot line and arc of the story.
And the other thing I noticed in your books, I wouldn't say they're specifically character driven, but the characters are definitely people you would like to know or you're interested in, you're vested in. And sometimes I think that's another key to suspension of disbelief. If you just like this guy, you don't really want to know how that works. You just want him to get there. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's it's, and I apologize to whatever author told me this in the past, but you know what storytelling is about, the story, right? It's about human relationships. That's what every single good story that you've ever read, every good movie you've ever watched, heck, most songs are all written about relationships between
Yeah.
people. And that's what stories are at the very essence, is just a relationship between the people. And that's why it's so important to get the reader invested with the characters, because if you don't make that connection, then it's just an exposition, really.
Well, and I'll tell you one of the reasons I started reading your books is because it was always a dream of mine to go into space. I wanted to be an astronaut. I knew I had health
Me
issues
too.
at the start. Oh yeah, I bet. But I was never going to qualify for that. Plus, I was a woman at a time when, you couldn't even get a job with the Navy. So, that wasn't going to happen. So, but I really wanted to be able to do that. And then my worst regret in life became that I would never go into space. My worst regret now is that I don't have the money because you can do it. So I I write a letter to Richard Branson every year and try and plead my case. I would fake death if that was required. I would say, "Oh, I'm dying, and tomorrow you need to send me quickly." So far, I haven't heard back.
No, me either.
So So, I mean, you've talked a little bit about this, but how has your writing evolved over time?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to have a combination of good friends who were very honest with me, and other authors who were further along the journey than I was, who were also very honest with me. You can be honest and still be kind. A lot of
Oh
times
yeah.
people feel that, to be honest, you got to beat people against the head with a mace, you know. Um, but that's I've been very fortunate for that because one of my first stories, you know, Third Exodus, when the first reader read it, he was like, "Is this supposed to be a screenplay?" I was like, "No, no." He said it's really kind of reading like a screenplay, and if anyone's ever read a screenplay, it's very descriptive in a boring way. You know, it's like camera pans over to the left and sees a dog on the fence, you know, or you know whatever. You know, lights come up, and when he said that, I reread it through that lens, and I was like, yeah, you're right. So I had to do some research and um, you know, understand the different ways of writing and different points of view and what that means and the characteristics of writing those points of view. And you know, the second and third attempts got better.
Mhm.
You know, they got better, and I'd like to think that you know I have continued to improve over the time. Haven't been able to write as much as I'd like because of the pesky day job, but
Yeah,
yeah,
all of us are facing that. I think though that well, I mean, I can say for sure that you are a very good writer because I was interested in this subject, and the other reason that I read is because and this is just my personal view. When I read a book, I become the character, and it's like living another life that you didn't get to live. So that's pretty cool. And sometimes you're going back in time. Um, to I obviously when I read historical fiction, I read times that I was interested in, and I'm really appreciative if the author did their job and they tell me what it's really like. And with your books, even with this in with the sci-fi especially, um, I can tell you that there were things I did not know and thought to myself, do you really want to go? I don't know. I would. I still would. But it was really interesting to know, and it was really interesting to sort of be the character.
yeah, and to your point of you know being able to identify the character and be the character. Um, a lot of my work is written from the perspective of the lesser served communities in science fiction, like the African American community and also um, females, right?
Mm.
So, um, you know, I'm neither, obviously, but I've tried to do the research and talk to people and understand that because, you know, I think science fiction is unique in a way in terms of a genre that's singularly unique from other genres because the neat thing about science fiction is that it allows you to separate yourself enough from reality to embrace some very hard topics. You know,
Yes.
be it ethics, usually ethics, or technology that's, you know, frightening because it's so new. And it allows us at a subconscious level, at a collective subconscious level, to really kind of work through these thoughts and these ideas and these conundrums without it having been really in your face like a documentary.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just need that, right? So having it written in a way that is accessible and identifiable with the different segments of our population and our society, I think is important. So that's one of the reasons why. Plus, you know, I have a daughter, so I want her to be able to read something that she can identify with and hopefully make herself a better person because of it. So
Yeah. And I think that the generally sci-fi, not all sci-fi, but generally sci-fi tends to do that. It tends to try to unite humanity, take away some of the sort of cultural um, problems that we have, or just even cultures. There in the sci-fi books that I've read, there is a culture, and it's kind of a better culture. It's one that we all hope to achieve someday. It's that better place down the road.
yeah, Susan Quinn, another very successful author, she has kind of really gotten into hope punk recently. And for those that don't know, it's kind of like steampunk, except it's like positive. It's got a positive outcome and a positive thing. And you know, we've all, myself included, been writing in the whole dystopian, you know, post-apocalyptic, apocalyptic genre for so long. If you were to chart that out, the number of stories in that genre, I mean, it's just you know almost exponential. Um, And I think, I think we're all doing that again for subconscious reasons from
Yeah.
society's perspective. And, Susan and some others have really kind of identified that and said, hey, if we're going to shape the future, let's start shaping the future in a way that's, more positive. And she's not wrong. And, it's kind of one of my challenges. A lot of my, at least my, in the Days of Humans novel, I always call it post-apocalyptic with hope because I don't leave you bummed out. And so while my story is not really hope punk, I think it's pretty close to that genre.
Yeah, I think that you have to start with some kind of an event, and it has to be something relatively traumatic. So it's either going to be an interpersonal, situation, or it's going to be something global or something catastrophic on another level. And then you have to let the characters tell you how that's going to go. And I
Right.
do think you're right. Generally, science fiction has been working a little bit better towards community building, like not just world building, but community building. I think that's what made the Star Trek franchise so iconic. Was it's not friends of mine who are now young and looking at that, and they're used to CGI and they tell me how lame it is, and I say you just have to understand the time in which this was done. First of all, that was as good as you could get, and they never did get rocks right. It doesn't look right in anyone that they've ever done.
No,
So,
no.
but they did get the an awful lot of the science correct. I mean, we're all carrying communicators now. Okay, we're all doing medical scanners. So, it's really funny
Yeah,
about that. But
yeah.
then
And
also,
the neat thing about those episodes, the old and on the next generation ones, was if you look at it, most every episode was dealing with a moral issue or an ethical
yes,
issue.
yes. And they snuck that past the censors.
Yeah.
And then the other thing too, and I did actually just talk to Susan, and we were talking about the fact that sometimes you can have a conversation with people through a story that if you were to have a direct conversation, they would argue with you. But if you're just telling a story,
Got to sneak
they're going to
attack,
listen. Might actually get through.
right?
Yeah. So Terry, you're a very diverse author, and you write in several different genre, and I would love for you to talk about that. What other genre you write in, and why you're cross genre like that?
Yeah. So, like we talked about earlier, I've done several short stories with David Smith in terms of his from the Canyons of the Damned. And when you first hear that title, you're probably thinking, but it's really it's kind of like Twilight Zone or the Dark
Mhm.
Mirror type of a collection of short stories and what have you. And it's been really nice because he's allowed me to try and stretch my wings with some other, genres like speculative fiction, which is not really science fiction. It's just kind of alternate reality, sort of. Like I said, kind of Twilight Zone type of thing. And I did in one of his volumes that was published in October of that year. I did my first take at a horror short story where I um, wrote a story about a doctor who ended up being patient zero for the zombie apocalypse. And
Oh,
and it was only through his own hubris and arrogance that it took place, right?
oh wow.
Um,
Okay.
and that was hard for me because that's just not a genre that I gravitate towards normally. But it was just kind of an exercise for me to try and stretch my muscles in that direction. So that was neat. Had another short story in there. It was about um, a researcher who researches whales and other um, seafaring mammals of that ilk. And it was really about the moment where he was able to communicate with them and the
Oh,
story that they had to tell him, which was not at all what he was wanting to hear.
oh,
Um, and I've had several people who read that like, dude, you totally got to make that into a novel. I'm like, I know,
yeah.
but and even with recent events, recent as of today, there's been a couple of pods of orcas that have been like attacking ships and stuff, and I've gotten several emails. They're like, aha, you're right. I'm like,
Mm.
I know, right? So that's hopefully sometime I can find a story to sometime to turn that story into a full blown novel. So that's the speculative fiction. I did write a book. Write's kind of a loose terminology. So, I live in the Houston area, and 4 or 5 years ago, Hurricane Harvey came and hit the Texas Gulf Coast, and then it moved up as a tropical storm and parked over Houston. Now, those of you who've never been to Houston, you can travel 30 miles from the coast and still be about 25 feet above sea level. I mean, it's flat, right? Um, well, Harvey dumped so much water over the Houston area in a couple of days, it literally deformed the crust of the land by 2 centimeters. I mean, it just deformed the surface of the earth by 2 centimeters because so much
Wow.
weight. If you were to put the amount of water, if you were to change that to snow, in
Oh.
2 days, we would have gotten the equivalent of 65 feet of snow.
Ugh.
I mean, it's truly apocalyptic type of level type of weather event. So, and also having lived in Houston, every major storm that's come through, I've gotten personally impacted. Either got flooded out or um, trees blown over onto my house, whatever, which is not too much fun, and it takes months and years to recover from those type of things. But Harvey was the first time that we were not personally impacted. So I had a bit of, I guess, PTSD or survivor's guilt or whatever you want to call it, because I know what that's like. So I spent a couple of weeks, took time off from work, spent a couple of weeks helping other people dig out their homes and just try to start the recovery process. Um, so along the way, before it landed and during the time it landed, every night, I was personally touched by the drama and the travesty and that and the damage that I saw. I would post kind of what the day's events were like to me on social media, and I got a lot of positive response from that. So what I did um, once I kind of got going back in the swing of things, I collected all of those social media posts into a book to kind of tell a visual chronological story of kind of how it evolved over time, which is kind of ironic because it's a physical book telling the story of a social media stream of information,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of opposite. But the hope was that any um, profits that came from the sale of this book, I would reinvest into local um, centers of need. When the time arose, and I did get some response, but that was more of a labor of love. So that was more realism. And then to your question about the genre, the third major genre I have written in is historical fiction, where um, I know you've read this book, and it's kind of one of my favorites as well. It's a historical fiction, and I've always thought, over my entire adult life, that shifting gears to the story of the Nativity,
Mhm.
Joseph, Mary, Jesus. Um, I've always thought that Joseph, his story was just undertold,
Yeah.
you know, um, and you don't have to be religious to appreciate that, right? Um, he, I always thought there's a bit of a element of comedy to that
Yeah.
situation. All due respect, I can just kind of be a fly on the wall, and Mary comes to him, and Joseph just kind of, you're what?
Right? How?
By who?
Yeah.
Hmm. So this is our story. It's. I mean, you just kind of, if you're putting yourself in his position, you're like, man, that was a
Yeah.
tough story to tell. And in the book, I treat it with all due seriousness and respect, but it's really telling. I'm also a stepfather, so it's a different role. It's a different responsibility than having biological children of your own, and it's a completely different experience. And it takes someone of a lot of strength and character to step up and do the right thing, you know?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of give due credit for what it would take for a man to do that, because what we have to remember at that period of time in history, the burning bushes and the dividing of the sea, that has been hundreds of years in the past, right? So it'd be almost like today for us. Like if some preacher's daughter came up pregnant, most of them are not going to believe it's a divine intervention,
Yeah.
Nobody's going to believe that, right? So it was kind of a similar situation back then. And what I learned during doing my research and reading some of the apocryphal texts that were written at the time but not included in the Bible collection, there's a lot of other stories that give a lot of context and a lot of details that you just don't get in the Hallmark version of it that's been published, right? And they went through some tough times. They got called onto the carpet. They went through tests that normally were weighted against women,
Yeah.
right? Because it's very patriarchal.
Yeah.
But yet, they came through, and it's a really interesting story. I mean, I said, even if you're not religious, it's a very fascinating. I found a very fascinating story, and just one I was really kind of glad after decades of thinking about it, finally getting it down onto paper.
I really love that book. It's one of my favorite of your books. And I think possibly because all the other stuff I know what to expect going in, but when I looked at this, I thought, I don't know. Let me think. I don't know. But I knew you. So I went ahead and I really did. I I I have to say that's exactly how it happened. Okay. That's just how it happened. That's what went through my head. And I did actually share it with my husband too. And he's not really a reader. And he started reading this and he says, oh, he was there. Terry was there. Okay, this was it. He and Joseph, they hung out and talked. So it was really good. And it was something that it's a secular book. It's not a religious text at all, but it is definitely something where if you even just know the nativity story, you have to have asked yourself about that. And so I really did enjoy that. And so the other one that is again outside what I would normally expect from a Terry R. Hill would be the Harvey one. And I was watching on social media as this was going on because, of course, you and several people in the area were people I was concerned about. I was really, really proud of you for taking that. I thought you might take it and turn it into a work of fiction, but you had so much real human connections going on, human people rising above the community that came out of that and everything. And I thought it's incredible. And it reads like a novel. It's not like a newspaper account of what happened. It's very personal. So I really liked it. And I don't know if you've thought about this. It may have been a nonfiction work, but it's definitely hope punk.
Oh. Yeah, I guess in some way, yeah. I mean, it was because it's always about trying to see the best in the situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And identifying
Yeah.
the
And there were
best.
an awful lot of acts of kindness going on in your book. And I know they were real, which makes it even that much
Yeah,
more emotional.
yeah, and it's interesting. I would not wish anyone to have to go through that, but if you do see some extraordinary acts of kindness from people that normally would not bother to cross the street for you.
Yeah.
So,
And that's a good point. I've been through a couple of hurricanes where we were without power and that kind of thing. And what typically ends up happening, and this is the thing that keeps me going when we've got a bad political climate going on, is that in every one of those situations, people were out with their grills. We were the ones that made the coffee in the morning, and then somebody else would, do something else. And there was a neighbor that came down that had never talked to anyone in the neighborhood during one of the storms. We happened to have a fireplace. We were up in northern Florida, and this was not actually a hurricane. This was the storm of the century up in Jacksonville. But anyway, a neighbor came down and knocked on the door, hat in his hand, and said, "Do you guys have any wood?" Because it was the first time they'd ever had to use their fireplace, and we all had to use our fireplaces. And we gave him wood, and and he became a part of that community, and that continued for quite some time afterwards until they moved away. But I mean, they had never talked to anybody; they were just to themselves. And then I don't know how the communities that you were talking about went, but in our community, it never went back to that everybody living in their little home, not interacting. We all walked the streets at night and said hello and brought pie to each other, and it's just never stopped being like that.
Yeah, it was interesting because you see all in the news after these events how the National Guard is out and the Army is out and they're distributing stuff. And I can say firsthand of the 2+ weeks that I was out in people's homes, never once did I see anybody of those groups show up. And that's not a ding against them, but my point is that all of the help and all of the coordination and all of the efforts, everybody handing out food, everybody handing out water and delivering meals, it was all locally driven.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
really the testament there.
Yeah. And, we're used to the Mad Max movies and stuff like that, And the fact of the matter is, and it may be not everywhere, but at least having been through hurricanes like Harvey, well, not that bad. None of mine were that bad, but I lived in Florida my whole life. And in every case, people came together, and it kind of gives me hope that people really are better than we portray them to be. So even in their
We still
worst.
hope.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
So
and I must say, the kind of tying it back to the writing, it is always a challenge writing in so many different genres because I've
yeah,
been advised against that from other successful authors. They're like, people, they need to know what to expect from you, and if you're just kind of bouncing all over the place, some of it
yeah,
they may like, some of it they may not, so that's always a risk. But on the flip side, for every bit of advice, there's equal opposite advice. The other opposite advice is people say, write what you like, write the stories that you want to read. And these are
for
the
sure.
stories I want to read.
Yeah. Well, I'm also seeing an awful lot more cross-genre stories. When my own book came out, my publisher asked me what it was, and I said, not sure. It started off at steampunk. I don't think it is. There's not enough airships and stuff in it. And he kept saying, okay, but what is it? And I said, kind of thinking YA. I'm not sure. I'm thinking Hunger Game-ish, sort of, but I should be so lucky. But and so when it came down to it, he's calling it, oh, I don't even think that this even applies, but he's calling it magic realism and sword and sorcery and like things that I would never apply to that. There's no magicians in there, but on the
Well, I
other
mean,
hand,
it also has, a large Victorian element, but yet there's definitely some elements of hard sci-fi in there too. So it's really, as I've told you before, it's really kind of a neat amalgamation of different genres that works.
I appreciate that. That thing is, though, the publishing industry gets all excited because they don't know what shelf to put that on.
Yeah, totally get
Where do people find it? I don't know. I can give you some like authors. I think you guys need to update your genre, really, is what is happening here.
Well, you just got to tell them they got to put it on the cat filter shelf, right?
There you go, all by itself. Yeah,
All
and
by
then
itself.
there's the Terry Hill, which has got everything from nonfiction to everything. So, so Hugh, we're also proud of Hugh. And as you said, his novel Wool has been adapted for TV and currently runs on Apple as Silo, which probably makes more sense if you haven't, if you're not familiar with the whole series. It wasn't a bad change of name. So let's pretend a publisher calls you and says, "Hey, Terry, we would like to adapt one of your stories or novels to a television series or a movie." Which one would it be and why?
Ooh, wow. Oh man. Um, that's a tough one because, they're selfishly, I think any of them would work. But,
They would.
I gotta say, usually your first novel is kind of like it's your baby, right? It's the one that you invested the most amount of emotional energy into because you wanted to make it perfect, and you really spent a lot of time thinking through it all. And I would say, the first three novels, which are all part of the same series of In the Days of Humans, um, I gotta tell you, I think that would really adapt itself well to a series that would give you a lot of bandwidth to tell a lot of very interesting stories
Absolutely.
beyond what have already been laid in there. And I think it's just an interesting universe to to build that story out in.
Yeah, I think so. If I was to pick, that's the one that I would. I mean, any of them would work, but that's the one that I would pick, and I would hope that they would do a television series rather than a novel because there's so much territory, and I could see 3 or 4 seasons minimum out of that.
And
And
I'd love to see like Idris Elba be like the
yeah,
main character. You know, I think he'd do an awesome job. And
yeah, yeah,
there's a few people I had in mind when I was writing. I was like, man, I'd so love to get a copy of this book in their hands. You know, in hopes
yeah,
that they would fall in love with it too.
absolutely. And that's always a thing. Did you ever envision anyone what your characters would look like?
Sometimes, yeah, yeah, sometimes because in my mind it helped give them voice.
Yeah,
You know, because I'm a very visual and auditory kind of guy, and you know, if I can see it or hear it, then just hearing the voice quality helps with the dialogue to just kind of evolve and flow more naturally in my mind, you know, as I'm writing.
yeah, yeah. I had somebody was coaching me at some point through when I was writing Shadowrunner, and she said, I want you to find pictures of Ada. I want you to find a child Ada, and I want you to find an adult Ada. And I thought, I mean, I've given a description. Why do I have to look at her? I didn't think that there was any purpose to this. So I wasn't thinking, there was no actor or actress. They wouldn't have been born yet. I wouldn't know who they were anyway. They would be in the younger generation of people I'm not familiar with or don't know their names. But I did actually find a picture, and it was really, really odd because I picked this picture of a child and I'm like, oh, that's her right there. Okay, so I sent that as part of my lesson. And then I picked an adult who looked like that child as, later in her life. And it turns out that this person is real. It's a Russian model. She's not an actress. And oddly, the child I picked is her.
Oh wow, wow, good eye.
I just saw the aging happen, but it
Yeah.
was her. I'm not sure that it helped me identify Ada anymore in my head, but the other really weird thing was it does help because this is what my writing coach was trying to do. She said, I want to know whether other people see what you see. So I showed the pictures to a couple of other authors, and they all said, yeah, we could see that. And my husband hadn't said anything. And after everybody else weighed in, just out of the blue one day, I mean, we weren't even talking about anything. We were just kind of hanging around. And finally he said, by the way, these pictures, and he pulled them up and I said, yeah. And he says, that's what I see. And so, yeah. So I think the looking for an actor or an actress is one thing, but looking for a likeness is what she was trying to do for me. And I think what she was trying to do was help me describe the person. I can see your people. I haven't seen an actor or an actress that I would identify, but for sure I know what they look like. And
Yeah, that's the tough part is, you know, really building out the character ahead of time. And that's something that, you know, I've always struggled with because if you know, read all the how-to books and go to the seminars, they're like, you got to build your character's profile. I mean, down to the nitnoid detail. What's their
yeah,
likes? What's their, you know, loves and hates, and what do they like to eat for lunch, and what color socks do they wear? And you know, I'm sure it's all very valuable, but to me, I always struggle with that, and I just kind of have to build their personality as they go, because that's kind of what the reader has got to experience is to kind of
mhm,
build their understanding of the personality of the character as they go,
yeah,
and also, you know, it kind of overlaps with the other um, rules of world building.
yeah,
And I've read many an author, a starting author, who they spend pages upon pages upon pages, you know, describing a house and what it looks like from the outside and the different birds in the trees. And, you know, you walk in, they describe all the paint and the dust bunnies on the floor. And what I tell them is like, you gotta put yourself in the mind of the character who's walking into that room. If
yeah,
they are like an Amazon delivery guy, all they're looking for is a flat spot to put the box, right?
yes,
But if they're a detective, then they're going to notice the knife on the floor and the stains on the carpet,
yes, yes.
you know.
And
And
I
same thing
think,
with the character development.
yeah, and I also think in world building that some effort has to be made for the things that you're describing to almost be characters themselves. Like the ship
Right.
becomes a character or whatever else that you're using. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have a personality or whatever, but it's important to the story. in some way. And everybody knows how a transporter works because they did a good job with it. Otherwise, we wouldn't care.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, Terry, is there any question I have not asked that you would have liked me to ask?
Well, I don't know, Kat, you've done a really good job of laying out some good questions. It's been quite pleasurable experience, almost conversational, so which has been very nice.
Well, this is my hope, and the purpose of this broadcast, or whatever you want to call it, is not really a podcast at all. It is author focused, and why I started doing this was because I have some friends who have said, "Oh, you know this person, you know that person," and I have said yes, and then, well, what's he like? What does he sound like? What is he, And I think that for the longest time, the publishers were keeping the reader and the writer apart. And now it's so much easier to find your favorite authors online and possibly even interact with them. But at very least, I thought that I would give the reader the experience of you read this book, you liked it. Did you know he writes other stuff? And this is what he sounds like. And this is what he's, this is his personality. I also hope that while people are here, they'll look at other videos and find new authors that they have not heard of before, and understand their personalities. So, yeah. I
totally resonate with what you said. While I happen to be an author, I'm also a reader. So, I'm totally a fanboy as well sometimes, and like to go listen to kind of what the authors really sound like, because it's usually nothing like the bios or whatever you're kind of spoon-fed, So I appreciate you doing this, because it does give you an opportunity to glimpse into the real person behind the face,
Yeah, I'm surprised to know that people are very interested in that. So, well, Terry, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And to the listeners, I will be putting links, as I always do, down in the bottom so that you can find Terry's books and other passion projects, all of the various questions that you're asking. You can find where he is down there and find him on social media too. So it's been great, Terry.
I enjoyed it.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.